The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in November, delivered by a uniformed messenger who waited with obvious impatience while my friend, Hercule Poirot, examined the heavy cream envelope with his characteristic thoroughness. I watched from my chair by the fire as he studied not merely the contents but the paper quality, the watermark, even the angle of the postmark. "Most interesting, Hastings," he murmured, his grey eyes bright with curiosity. "Lady Millicent Ravenswood requests our presence at Ravenswood Manor for what she terms a small gathering of old friends. Yet observe," he held the paper to the light, "the hand that wrote this invitation trembled slightly. See here, the downward stroke of the G in gathering? And here, where she has pressed too firmly with the pen?" I leaned forward to examine the elegant script. Perhaps she was merely tired when she wrote it. Perhaps. Or perhaps Lady Ravenswood has something weighing upon her mind, something that makes her hand unsteady, and her need for a detective urgent, though she does not say so directly. Poirot set the invitation on his precisely arranged desk. "Tell me, mon ami, what do you know of the Ravenswood family?" I searched my memory. "Old county family, I believe." "The late Lord Ravenswood was something of a sportsman, hunting, racing, that sort of thing. Left considerable debts when he died 5 years ago. The current lord, Julian, I think, was invalided out of the war. Lung trouble, if I recall correctly." "Précisément." "And the lady herself?" "Lady Millicent was considered quite a beauty in her day. Society hostess, patron of the arts, rather formidable by all accounts. She remarried 2 years ago, a younger man, American, I believe, caused quite a stir in the county." Poirot's eyebrows rose expressively. "Ah, yes, Mr. Charles Whitmore, the American industrialist, a man who made his fortune in steel and his reputation in ruthlessness. An interesting combination, the English aristocrat and the American millionaire. One wonders what has brought them to require the services of Hercule Poirot." "Surely you don't suspect—" "I suspect nothing, Hastings. I merely observe that when a lady of Lady Ravenswood's standing invites a detective to what she describes as a small gathering of old friends, she does so for reasons that extend beyond social courtesy." He rose from his chair with characteristic precision. "We shall accept, naturally. The countryside in November may be damp and disagreeable, but human nature remains fascinating in all seasons. And so it was that we found ourselves, 2 days later, in a railway carriage bound for Sussex, watching the grey November landscape roll past the windows. Poirot spent the journey in contemplation, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, while I attempted to read the morning papers. The headlines spoke of financial uncertainty, political tensions, and the usual concerns of post-war England, but my attention kept wandering to the approaching visit. Ravenswood Manor emerged from the afternoon mist like something from a Gothic novel, a sprawling stone edifice that had clearly grown over centuries, each generation adding its own architectural flourishes to the original medieval core. The central block was Elizabethan, with tall, mullioned windows and elaborate chimneys, while newer wings stretched out on either side like protective arms. The whole structure seemed to brood on its hilltop setting, surrounded by ancient oaks whose bare branches clawed at the lowering sky. A footman met us at the entrance, a young man whose nervous demeanour immediately caught Poirot's attention. As we were relieved of our coats and ushered into the great hall, I noticed my friend's eyes cataloguing every detail. The worn Persian carpets, the portraits of long-dead Ravenswoods staring down from the panelled walls, the massive fireplace where logs crackled and sparked. "Monsieur Poirot! Captain Hastings!" Lady Millicent Ravenswood swept toward us across the polished floor, her hands extended in welcome. She was a woman in her early 50s, still handsome, despite the lines that worry had etched around her eyes. Her dark hair was elegantly styled, her dress impeccable, but I noticed the same slight tremor in her hands that Poirot had detected in her handwriting. "Lady Ravenswood," Poirot bowed with old-world courtesy, "we are honored by your invitation." "The honor is mine, I assure you. Your reputation precedes you, Monsieur Poirot. I confess I have need of your particular expertise." "Indeed. Perhaps you will enlighten me as to the nature of this need." Lady Ravenswood glanced around the hall, then lowered her voice. "Not here. There are too many ears, and walls have a way of remembering conversations. But tonight, after dinner, we must speak privately. There are complications that require delicate handling." Before Poirot could respond, a man emerged from the shadows near the staircase. He was perhaps 45, tall and lean, with prematurely grey hair and the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though each step required conscious effort. "Julian," Lady Ravenswood said, "allow me to present Monsieur Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. Gentlemen, my son, Lord Ravenswood." Julian Ravenswood extended a thin hand. His grip was firm despite his apparent frailty, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that reminded me of his mother. "Monsieur Poirot, your presence here is unexpected. Mother didn't mention she had invited a detective to our little gathering. Did she not?" Poirot's tone was mild, but I caught the sharp glance he directed at Lady Ravenswood. Perhaps she wished it to be a surprise. Perhaps. Julian's smile was thin. "Well, you'll find our other guests equally surprising. We're quite an eclectic group this weekend." As if summoned by his words, voices echoed from the drawing-room beyond. Lady Ravenswood led us through tall double doors into a magnificent chamber where the other members of the house party had assembled for tea. The room was elegant but comfortable, with deep sofas arranged around a crackling fire and French windows that looked out onto formal gardens now shrouded in November gloom. "Allow me to make the introductions," Lady Ravenswood said, and I prepared myself for the familiar ritual of a country house weekend. There was Mr. Charles Whitmore, Lady Ravenswood's American husband, a vigorous man in his early 40s with steel-grey hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but his eyes remained watchful. Miss Helena Ravenswood, Julian's wife, proved to be a striking woman with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She greeted us with polite reserve, though I noticed how her gaze lingered on Poirot with what might have been apprehension. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, the family physician, was a stout, comfortable-looking man in his 60s whose shrewd eyes missed nothing. He had, Lady Ravenswood explained, been treating the family for years and was considered almost one of them. Colonel Geoffrey Ashworth, an old friend of the late Lord Ravenswood, cut an impressive figure despite his 70 years. His military bearing was unmistakable, his white moustache perfectly waxed, his manner that of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Mrs. Lydia Pemberton, Lady Ravenswood's cousin, was a woman of middle years whose sharp features and penetrating gaze suggested a formidable intellect. She examined Poirot with undisguised curiosity, as though he were a specimen under a microscope. Finally, there was Mr. Adrian Blackwood, a sleek, dark-haired man in his 30s, who was introduced as the family's solicitor. His manner was professionally courteous, but I detected an underlying tension in his bearing that suggested all was not well in the legal affairs of the Ravenswood estate. As we settled into the comfortable chairs and accepted cups of tea, I found myself studying each face in turn. Here, according to Christie's formula, were our suspects, though suspects in what crime I could not yet say. But Poirot's earlier words echoed in my mind. Lady Ravenswood had not invited a detective to a social gathering without good reason. The conversation flowed along conventional lines, the weather, London gossip, the state of the roads. But underneath the polite chatter, I sensed currents of tension. Glances were exchanged, remarks carried double meanings, and more than once I caught someone studying Poirot with barely concealed anxiety. It was during dinner that the first crack appeared in the facade of civilized behavior. We had progressed through several courses, the conversation lubricated by excellent wine, when Colonel Ashworth made what seemed an innocent observation about the family portraits in the dining room. "That's old, sir." "Reginald, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward a stern-faced gentleman in Elizabethan dress who glowered down from above the sideboard. "Always reminded me of a hanging judge. Appropriate, considering the family history." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Julian Ravenswood's fork paused halfway to his mouth, while his mother's face went pale. "I'm not sure what you mean, Colonel," Lady Ravenswood said quietly. "Oh, come now, Millicent. We all know the stories. The Ravenswood curse, they used to call it. How many of the family have met unusual ends over the centuries?" "Superstitious nonsense," Mr. Whitmore interjected, his American practicality cutting through the growing tension. "Every old family has its share of tragedies. It's statistics, not supernatural intervention." "Is it?" Dr. Thornfield mused, swirling his wine thoughtfully. "I've always found it curious how certain patterns repeat themselves through generations. Take the current family, for instance. Julian's father died in a hunting accident. Thrown from his horse, they said, though he was one of the finest riders in the county. Julian's grandfather died in his study, apparently of a heart attack, though he was in perfect health. His great-grandfather— "Oh, that's quite enough," Julian said sharply, his voice cutting through the doctor's recitation like a blade. "I think we've heard sufficient family history for one evening." But the damage was done. The atmosphere had shifted, become charged with something darker than mere social awkwardness. I glanced at Poirot and saw that he was watching each face with intense concentration, his grey cells no doubt cataloguing every reaction, every telltale sign of guilt or fear. It was then that Lady Ravenswood rose from her chair, her composure restored, but her hands still trembling slightly. "Perhaps the gentleman would care to adjourn to the library for brandy and cigars? The ladies and I will take coffee in the drawing-room." As we followed our host toward the library, I found myself walking beside Poirot. In a low voice I murmured, "What do you make of all this talk of curses and family deaths?" "I make of it, Hastings, that someone in this house is very much afraid," he replied quietly. "The question is whether they fear the past or the future." The library was a magnificent room, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. A fire burned in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpets and comfortable leather chairs. Mr. Whitmore poured brandy from a crystal decanter, while Julian offered cigars from a humidor. For a time, the conversation remained safely neutral: politics, business, the prospects for the coming year. But as the brandy loosened tongues and the hour grew late, more personal matters began to surface. "I say, Julian," Colonel Ashworth observed, settling back in his chair with his brandy, "you're looking rather better than when I last saw you. Dr. Thornfield's treatment seemed to be working." Julian's laugh was bitter. "Better? I suppose that's relative, Colonel. Better than a corpse, certainly, but that's damning with faint praise." "Now, my boy," Dr. Thornfield interjected, "you mustn't be so pessimistic. Your condition has stabilized considerably. With proper care and attention to your health— With proper care and attention, I might live another 5 years instead of 2, Julian interrupted. "Forgive me if I don't find that particularly encouraging." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should rejoin the ladies," he suggested. "Yes," Julian agreed, rising from his chair with obvious effort. "I think I've provided enough entertainment for one evening." As we made our way back to the drawing room, I noticed Poirot lagging behind, his attention caught by something near the library's French windows. When I paused to wait for him, he gestured for me to continue. "Go ahead, Hastings. I will join you presently." I found the ladies in the drawing room, engaged in what appeared to be a strained conversation about local charity work. Lady Ravenswood looked up as we entered, her eyes immediately searching for Poirot. "Where is Monsieur Poirot?" she asked. "Still in the library," I replied. "He'll be along shortly." But when Poirot finally appeared, his expression was thoughtful, almost troubled. He accepted a cup of coffee from Helena Ravenswood, but remained standing, his gaze moving from face to face with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. "Lady Ravenswood," he said finally, "perhaps now would be an appropriate time for that private conversation you mentioned?" She nodded, rising from her chair. "Of course, we can speak in my sitting room. It's quite private there." As they left the drawing room together, I found myself alone with the other guests. The conversation gradually resumed, but I noticed how often eyes strayed toward the door through which Poirot and Lady Ravenswood had disappeared. Whatever secrets this house held, it seemed everyone was aware of them, and everyone was waiting to see what the famous Belgian detective would make of them. It was nearly midnight when Poirot returned to the drawing room, his face grave. Lady Ravenswood was not with him, and when I inquired about her, he merely said she had retired for the evening. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly. "I think we too should seek our beds. Tomorrow promises to be a most interesting day." As we climbed the great staircase to our rooms, I ventured to ask what Lady Ravenswood had told him. "She has told me, mon ami, that she fears for her life. And after what I have learned tonight, I fear she may have good reason." I was about to press him for details when a scream shattered the nighttime quiet, a woman's scream, high and piercing, filled with terror and horror. We rushed toward the sound, our feet pounding on the polished floors. Other doors were opening, other guests emerging in various states of undress. The scream had come from the east wing, where the family's private rooms were located. We found Helena Ravenswood standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a study, her face white with shock, her hand pressed to her mouth. Beyond her, slumped over a massive oak desk, was the motionless form of Charles Whitmore. Dr. Thornfield pushed past us, his medical training overriding social niceties. He knelt beside the fallen man, checking for pulse and breathing. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he looked up, his face grim. "He's dead," he announced quietly. "Poisoned, I'd say, from the smell and the symptoms. Poor devil never had a chance." As the others crowded into the study, their voices rising in shock and confusion, I saw Poirot step forward. His keen eyes took in every detail of the scene, the position of the body, the papers scattered on the desk, the half-empty brandy glass that sat nearby. "Nobody must touch anything," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "This is now a crime scene, and it must be preserved exactly as it is." He turned to face the assembled group, his grey eyes hard as steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we are dealing with murder, and until the local police arrive, I must ask that no one leave the house." The weekend house party at Ravenswood Manor had taken a decidedly sinister turn, and somewhere among the shocked faces surrounding me stood a killer who had already struck once and might well strike again. The immediate aftermath of Dr. Thornfield's grim pronouncement brought chaos to the elegant study. Helena Ravenswood remained frozen in the doorway, her face chalk white, while Lady Millicent appeared at her shoulder, hastily dressed in a silk wrapper. Upon seeing her husband's motionless form slumped over the mahogany desk, she swayed dangerously before Colonel Ashworth steadied her with a firm hand. Poirot moved through the confusion with quiet authority, positioning himself strategically between the body and the assembled household. His keen eyes swept the room methodically, cataloguing every detail with that remarkable precision I had come to admire. "Dr. Thornfield," he said quietly, "you mentioned poison. The symptoms suggest what precisely?" The physician looked up from his examination, his face grave. "Cyanide, I believe. The bitter almond scent is faint but unmistakable, and observe the coloration of the lips and fingernails. Death would have been almost instantaneous." "Precisement. And the brandy glass? Half empty, yes?" "So our victim took his death with his evening drink." Poirot's gaze moved to the crystal decanter on the side table. "Tell me, Lady Ravenswood, was it Mr. Whitmore's habit to take brandy while working?" She nodded mutely, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "Always. He said it helped him concentrate on his correspondence." "And who in this household would know of this habit?" "Everyone, I suppose. Charles made no secret of his preferences." Poirot turned to address the group. "I must establish a timeline. When did each of you last see Mr. Whitmore alive?" Julian Ravenswood spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. "I saw him perhaps an hour ago. He said he was retiring to his study to review some business papers. He seemed perfectly normal then." "And you accompanied him?" "No, he went alone, as was his custom." Mrs. Pemberton cleared her throat. "I saw him briefly in the hall around 10:30. He appeared agitated, muttering something about ghosts from the past that wouldn't stay buried. This drew sharp glances from several members of the household. Lady Ravenswood's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible. "Most interesting," Poirot murmured. "Lady Ravenswood, after our conversation this evening, did you see your husband again?" "Yes," she whispered. "He came to my sitting room around 10:30. He was disturbed about something. He mentioned receiving a letter that morning, something that had upset him greatly. When I asked to see it, he said he had already burned it." "A letter, you say? And its contents?" "He wouldn't tell me. Only that it concerned old business he thought was finished forever." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "And then?" "He said he had urgent matters to attend to in his study. That was the last time I saw him alive." The solicitor, Mr. Blackwood, shifted uncomfortably. "I visited the study around 11:15. Mr. Whitmore was alive then, pouring himself a brandy. He was in a foul temper and told me to leave, said he was expecting someone else." "Someone else?" Poirot's voice sharpened. "Did he specify whom?" "No, but he glanced at the mantel clock. He was definitely expecting a visitor." Helena Ravenswood finally found her voice. "I went to the study just before midnight to retrieve a book I had left there earlier. The door was slightly ajar. When I looked in," she shuddered, "he was already slumped over the desk. I screamed immediately." "You touched nothing?" "Nothing. I was too frightened." Poirot nodded slowly, his grey cells clearly working furiously. "So we established that Mr. Whitmore was alive at 11:15 when Mr. Blackwood departed, and dead when Madame Helena discovered him just before midnight, 45 minutes in which death paid a visit. He moved to examine the French windows behind the desk. Locked from the inside, the key on the desk, so our murderer did not flee through the garden. They walked out through the same door they entered." Colonel Ashworth harumphed. "But we were all accounted for," Most of us were in the drawing room or retired to our chambers. Were you, Colonel? I myself was elsewhere, as was Lady Ravenswood. Several others have admitted to being alone in their rooms. Poirot's gaze swept the assembled faces. No, I think we shall find that between 11:15 and midnight, someone in this house kept an appointment with death and served it in a brandy glass. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and barely concealed fear. Somewhere among these respectable people stood a murderer, and Hercule Poirot had begun the delicate process of drawing them into the light. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard arrived at Ravenswood Manor shortly after 2 o'clock, his familiar bulk filling the doorway of the great hall. His presence was both reassuring and fortuitous. He and Poirot had collaborated on numerous cases, and his shrewd, practical approach complemented the Belgian detective's more cerebral methods perfectly. "Trust you to be in the thick of another murder, Poirot," Japp said with weary affection, surveying the assembled household with experienced eyes. "Right then, what have we got?" Poirot drew him aside while the police photographer completed his work in the study. "Cyanide in the brandy, administered sometime between 11:15 and midnight. The victim was expecting someone. Mr. Blackwood heard him say, 'You're late,' as he departed the study. Appointment with his killer, you think? Précisément. But observe, Inspector, this was no crime of passion. Someone obtained cyanide, planned the timing, and executed the murder with cold precision. They knew Mr. Whitmore's habits intimately." Japp nodded grimly. "I'll need to interview everyone separately. Can you arrange the use of a private room?" "The morning room, I think. And, Inspector, watch their faces carefully. I have already observed that not all reactions to the discovery were equally genuine." The interviews began at dawn. Julian Ravenswood entered first, his pallor more pronounced than ever, his breathing laboured from the stress. Japp's questioning was methodical, but not unsympathetic. "Your relationship with your stepfather, my lord." Julian's hands clenched in his lap. "Complicated. Charles married my mother to save the estate from bankruptcy, and he never let us forget it. He used his financial control as leverage, threatening to withdraw support whenever we displeased him. That must have been difficult." "Humiliating," Julian corrected bitterly. "But here's the irony, Inspector. His death actually secures our future more than his life did. His will establishes a permanent trust for the estate's maintenance. He can no longer hold his money over our heads like a sword." Poirot leaned forward. "So financially, you benefit from his death?" "Paradoxically, yes, though I hardly wished him dead for it." "Yet you mentioned he was perfectly normal when you last saw him, while others describe him as agitated." Julian flushed. "Perhaps I was being diplomatic." Charles was furious. About something. A letter he'd received. He was muttering about old ghosts and buried business that wouldn't stay buried. Mrs. Pemberton entered next, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room before settling on her interrogators. Her manner was crisp, uncompromising. "You observed Mr. Whitmore in the hall at 10:30, Japp began. "What exactly did you hear?" "He was talking to himself. Some ghosts refused to stay buried," he said, "and something about paying for old sins." He looked haggard, frightened even. "You disliked him?" "Intensely. He was a bully who treated this house like a business acquisition rather than a family home. But more than that—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There were tensions in this household that Charles exploited. He had a roving eye and little conscience about using his position to pressure vulnerable people." "You refer to someone specific?" "Helena. Charles had been pursuing her quite persistently. Yesterday afternoon I witnessed what appeared to be a heated argument between them in the conservatory." Helena Ravenswood's interview revealed the full extent of her predicament. She sat rigidly upright, her composure brittle as spun glass. "Mrs. Pemberton suggests Mr. Whitmore was inappropriate with you," Japp said gently. Helena's facade cracked slightly. "He offered to set me up in London, away from Julian and this house. He said he could give me freedom, independence, everything I felt I was missing." "At the price?" "Myself, my reputation, my marriage." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "When I refused him yesterday afternoon, he became furious. He threatened to cut off Julian's allowance entirely, to ruin us financially unless I reconsidered. So you had strong motivation to silence him before he could carry out that threat. I went to the study to plead with him one final time for Julian's sake. That's when I found him already dead. Finally, Adrian Blackwood confirmed the evening's legal business. Mr. Whitmore wished to alter his will. He was quite agitated about it, kept checking the clock. When I left at 11:15, he said someone was late for an appointment." "The nature of these alterations?" Blackwood hesitated. "Professional confidence." "Your client is beyond caring about confidentiality," Japp interrupted. "He wanted to disinherit someone completely, said they'd betrayed his trust for the last time." As the interviews concluded, Poirot stood by the morning room window, watching the November mist swirl around the ancient oaks. "You see, Inspector, everyone had motive, money, passion, pride, but someone had more than motive. Someone had a secret worth killing for." The grey November morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Ravenswood Manor like a shroud. The household moved through their routines with the careful precision of people aware they were being watched, each gesture scrutinized for signs of guilt or innocence. Poirot and I breakfasted in relative solitude, the other guests having retreated to their chambers or found excuses to avoid common areas. Inspector Japp had departed temporarily to coordinate with the local constabulary, leaving strict instructions that no one was to leave the premises. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, adding to the sense of confinement that seemed to press down upon us all. "You are unusually silent, Hastings," Poirot observed, setting down his coffee cup with characteristic precision. "Come, what does your excellent British common sense make of our little drama?" I considered the question carefully, thinking back to the previous night's interviews. "I confess I'm baffled, Poirot. Any one of them might have killed Whitmore. Julian for freedom from financial tyranny, Helena to escape his unwanted advances, Lady Ravenswood to protect her family's dignity. Even Mrs. Pemberton and Colonel Ashworth had reasons to resent the man." "You forget Dr. Thornfield and Mr. Blackwood," Poirot said mildly, his grey eyes thoughtful. "The one who handles the medicines, the other who knows the legal affairs. In an English country house mystery, Hastings, they are often as dangerous as the family members themselves." "You suspect the doctor?" "I suspect everyone until the evidence tells me otherwise. It is the only safe method." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "But you confuse motive with opportunity, mon ami. We must consider the practicalities of the crime. The cyanide, who had access? The brandy glass, was the poison placed before Mr. Whitmore poured or after? The appointment, he expected someone, there was no struggle. And always we returned to that mysterious letter which so disturbed him. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Dr. Thornfield entered, his usual jovial manner subdued by the night's events. His face was grave, and I noticed his hands trembled slightly as he closed the door behind him. "Monsieur Poirot, might I have a word? There's something troubling me about last night. Something I should have mentioned during my interview with Inspector Japp." "Mais certainement, Doctor. Please, sit." Thornfield settled heavily into a chair, his bulk making the furniture creak. "It's about the cyanide. You see, I keep a small quantity in my medical bag for legitimate purposes. Treatment of certain cardiac conditions, you understand. This morning, I conducted a thorough inventory of my supplies." He paused, his face growing even more troubled. "A vial is missing. Taken sometime within the past week." Poirot leaned forward intently, his entire demeanor sharpening. "You are absolutely certain of this?" "Completely. I conducted a full inventory just last Wednesday when I restocked my bag. The vial was there then. I'm meticulous about such things, given the dangerous nature of the substance. Now it's gone. And who would have had access to your medical bag during this period?" "That's the difficulty, Monsieur Poirot. I've been treating the family regularly. Julian's lung condition requires frequent monitoring. Lady Ravenswood suffers from nervous headaches, and I've been attending to various minor ailments throughout the household. My bag has been in and out of different rooms constantly. Anyone could have taken the opportunity when my attention was elsewhere." Poirot nodded slowly, his grey cells clearly working furiously. "This suggests premeditation, not a crime of passion. Someone planned this murder with considerable forethought." His eyes narrowed as he studied the doctor's face. "Tell me, Dr. Thornfield, your professional observations of the family dynamics. You have treated them for years. What secrets does this household harbour?" Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Professional ethics are superseded by murder, I think. Come, doctor. A man is dead and his killer walks free among us. What can you tell us that might prevent another death?" The physician sighed deeply, the weight of his knowledge clearly troubling him. "Very well. Julian's condition is more serious than we've told him. The lung damage from the gas attacks is progressive, irreversible. He has perhaps 18 months, 2 years at most. The strain on Helena has been immense, watching her husband slowly deteriorate while feeling trapped in this isolated house. And Lady Ravenswood's marriage to Mr. Whitmore. A marriage of convenience that became a prison. Millicent married him out of desperation. The estate was drowning in debt, creditors circling like vultures. Whitmore offered salvation, but at a terrible price. He controlled every penny, made every decision, treated the family like employees rather than relatives. She became a prisoner in her own ancestral home. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured. "And now, doctor, I must ask you to accompany us to the study. I wish to examine the scene once more, and your medical expertise may prove valuable." The study remained sealed by police order, but Japp had given Poirot permission to investigate further. We found the room exactly as it had been left, the body removed but everything else preserved in its original state. Poirot went immediately to the desk, examining the scattered correspondence with meticulous care. "Regardez, Hastings. Business letters, bills, social invitations, all quite ordinary for a man of Whitmore's position." He moved to the fireplace, kneeling to examine the grate more closely. "But see here." He held up several charred fragments retrieved from among the ashes. "This was burned recently, yet not completely consumed. The paper is expensive, American manufacture, and these few words that remain legible. The truth about Chicago 20 years ago cannot remain silent." "The letter Lady Ravenswood mentioned," I exclaimed. "The one that upset Whitmore so greatly." "Precisely. Someone was threatening to expose something from Whitmore's past in Chicago, something significant enough to warrant murder, either to silence Whitmore before he could act on the threat, or to prevent him from revealing what he knew about the letter's author." Dr. Thornfield had grown very pale during this exchange. "Chicago," he whispered, 20 years ago. There were rumors, whispers, in certain circles. A young woman who worked in one of Whitmore's factories died under suspicious circumstances. The official verdict was suicide, but there was talk of scandal, of Whitmore's involvement with her. "And this young woman's name?" Poirot asked quietly. I'm not certain I should—" "Doctor," Poirot's voice carried quiet authority, "a man has been murdered in this house. If you know something that might prevent further bloodshed, you have a moral obligation to speak." Thornfield nodded reluctantly. Sarah Blackwood, she was Adrian Blackwood's sister. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Suddenly the solicitor's nervous behavior, his intimate knowledge of the family's affairs, his presence in the study shortly before Whitmore's death, all took on a more sinister cast. "We must speak with Mr. Blackwood immediately," I said, but Poirot held up a restraining hand. "Not yet, Hastings. We have established motive and means, but we must also consider opportunity and method. The killer was clever. They used the victim's own habits against him, knowing he would be alone in his study with his evening brandy, but they also took considerable risk. What if Whitmore had not drunk the poisoned brandy immediately? What if someone else had entered the study first? "Unless," Dr. Thornfield said slowly, "the killer was someone Whitmore was expecting, someone he trusted enough to drink with." "Exactament. The appointment Mr. Blackwood mentioned." "You're late," Whitmore said. "He was expecting his killer, and when they arrived, he welcomed them into his study for what he believed would be a private conversation." A sound from the corridor made us turn. Lady Ravenswood stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed. She had clearly overheard our conversation, and her expression held a mixture of fear and resignation. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "there are things about this family's history that you need to understand. The Ravenswood curse is not merely superstition, it's a pattern of violence that has repeated itself for generations. My husband's father died, locked in his study, apparently alone, yet his safe stood open and certain papers were missing. Before that, Julian's grandfather was found drowned in the lake, though he feared deep water. Each time people spoke of the curse, but I've always suspected human malice." "You fear the pattern is continuing?" Poirot observed. "I fear that someone is determined to destroy this family, one by one. Charles's death follows the same pattern. Alone in a locked room, papers scattered before him, secrets threatened with exposure." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And Julian is so weak, so vulnerable. If the killer strikes again—" "They will not," Poirot said firmly. "Because tonight, madame, we shall unmask them. But first I must gather one final piece of evidence. The truth lies not only in this room, but in the secrets buried in the grounds of Ravenswood Manor itself." The investigation was far from over, but the net was beginning to close around our quarry. The missing cyanide, the burnt letter, the Chicago connection, all pointed toward a carefully planned revenge that had been 20 years in the making. Yet questions remained, and Hercule Poirot was not a man to act until every piece of the puzzle was firmly in place. The grey November afternoon provided little comfort as Poirot and I ventured on to the rain-soaked grounds of Ravenswood Manor. The formal gardens, once the pride of the estate, now bore the melancholy aspect of genteel decay. Wet leaves clung to the gravel paths, and the ancient yews dripped steadily in the stillness that follows a storm. Poirot moved with characteristic precision across the terrace outside the study, his keen eyes scanning the muddy flower beds beneath the tall windows. Despite the dampness that threatened his immaculate appearance, he seemed oblivious to everything save the evidence he sought among the sodden earth and dripping rhododendrons. "The rain, she has been both friend and enemy to us," he murmured, crouching beside a particularly dense shrub. "She washes away footprints, yes, but she also preserves what is pressed deep into the mud." With infinite care, he extracted a small object from beneath the tangled roots, wrapping it in his pristine handkerchief. I leaned closer to examine his find, a cut-glass stopper no larger than a thimble, its faceted surface catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky. "From the missing cyanide vial?" "Précisément. And observe, Hastings, the earth here is disturbed, trampled. Someone stood in this very spot for some time, watching the study windows. The question is whether this someone was our killer or merely another player in this elaborate drama." Inspector Japp, who had been examining the exterior of the study windows, approached with a grim expression. "The window locks are secure from the inside, just as we found them. If someone was standing here last night, they were watching, not entering." "Which suggests," Poirot said thoughtfully, "that we have either discovered our killer's vantage point, or we have found evidence of a witness to the crime. In either case, we must speak with Mr. Blackwood again. The Chicago connection grows, more significant with each passing hour." We found the solicitor in the morning room, ostensibly reviewing legal documents, but clearly unable to concentrate. His hands trembled as he set down his teacup, and the careful composure he had maintained since our arrival had begun to crack under the strain of investigation. "Mr. Blackwood," Poirot began gently, settling into the chair opposite him, "we have discovered something in the grounds that requires explanation." He produced the glass stopper, placing it carefully on the table between them. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Blackwood's face went ashen, and his carefully maintained professional demeanor crumbled entirely. For a long moment he stared at the small object as though it were a venomous serpent. "Where did you find it?" he whispered. "Beneath the rhododendrons outside the study window. You recognize it, I think?" Blackwood nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "It's from the vial I took from Dr. Thornfield's bag. I threw it away in a moment of disgust with myself." "So you admit to taking the cyanide?" Japp interjected, his notebook already in hand. "Yes, but not to using it." Blackwood looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and desperation. "You want to know about Chicago, about Sarah? Very well, she was my sister, my younger sister, bright and ambitious and full of life. 20 years ago she went to work in one of Whitmore's factories. Within 6 months, she was dead." The story that emerged was both tragic and familiar. A young woman exploited by a powerful man, abandoned when she became inconvenient, driven to desperation by circumstances beyond her control. Blackwood's voice grew stronger as he spoke, fueled by decades of suppressed anger and grief. "The official verdict was suicide, but I knew better. Sarah had written to me just days before her death saying she had discovered something about Whitmore's business practices, something that could destroy him. She was going to expose him, and he knew it. Her death was far too convenient to be coincidental." "And so you became the family's solicitor to gain access to his affairs," Poirot observed. "I changed my name, built a new identity, worked my way up in the legal profession with one goal in mind, to find the evidence that would bring Charles Whitmore to justice. When the opportunity arose to become the Ravenswood family's solicitor, I seized it. I thought I could finally prove what he had done to Sarah." "Yet last night you took the cyanide," Japp pressed. "You stood outside his window. You had means, motive, and opportunity." "I took the vial in a moment of madness, yes. I stood in that flower bed for nearly an hour, watching him through the window, wrestling with my conscience. I wanted him dead. God help me, I wanted to watch him suffer as Sarah had suffered. But when the moment came, I couldn't do it. I threw the stopper away and turned to leave." "And Whitmore was alive when you departed?" "Very much alive. In fact, he appeared to be expecting someone. He kept checking his watch, and just as I was leaving, I saw him smile, a triumphant, almost gloating expression. He raised his brandy glass as though in a toast to someone I couldn't see from my position. Poirot leaned forward intently. Someone else was in the room? I believe so. The high-backed chair near the fireplace blocked my view, but Whitmore was definitely addressing someone. His manner was that of a man who believed he had won a great victory. After Blackwood was escorted to his room under police supervision, Poirot paced the morning room with obvious agitation. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the strain, his tie slightly askew, his moustache requiring attention. "It fits too perfectly, Hastings," he said, finally. "The wronged brother, the stolen poison, the presence at the scene, all the elements align with mathematical precision. Yet in my experience, when the solution to a murder presents itself so conveniently, it is often because someone has arranged it to appear so." "You think Blackwood is innocent?" "I think Blackwood is a man consumed by grief and guilt who has made himself the perfect scapegoat. But consider, if he truly intended revenge, why kill Whitmore on the very night he planned to expose him? And that smile Blackwood described suggests Whitmore believed he was safe, that he had neutralized whatever threat faced him. Then who was in the chair? That, mon ami, is the question that will unlock this entire mystery. Someone sat with Charles Whitmore in his final moments, someone he trusted enough to drink with, someone who allowed him to believe he had triumphed even as death approached. Poirot's grey eyes hardened with determination. "We must find that person before they strike again, for I fear that Charles Whitmore's murder was not an end, but a beginning." The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the manor's ancient stones, and somewhere within those walls walked a killer who had successfully deflected suspicion onto the most obvious suspect. The game, as Poirot would say, was far from over. The grey November evening settled over Ravenswood Manor like a shroud, bringing with it an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down upon the assembled household. Inspector Japp moved through the corridors with obvious satisfaction, convinced that Adrian Blackwood's confession had solved the case with admirable efficiency. Yet Poirot remained deeply troubled, his grey eyes reflecting a skepticism that grew stronger with each passing hour. "The solution presents itself too perfectly, Hastings," he murmured as we stood in the great hall, watching the inspector coordinate with his subordinates. "In my experience, when all evidence points so conveniently to one suspect, it is often because someone has arranged it to appear so." Before I could respond, Lady Ravenswood appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her face pale but determined. She descended with careful dignity, though I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the banister. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "there is something I must show you before dinner. Something that may explain why Charles had to die." She led us to a small, private study that had belonged to her first husband, a room preserved exactly as it had been at the time of his death 5 years earlier. The atmosphere was thick with memories and secrets, the very air seeming to whisper of past tragedies. "Julian's father died in this room," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alone, with the door locked from within. The official verdict was heart failure, but there were irregularities." From a desk drawer she produced a packet of yellowed letters. He had received threatening correspondence in the weeks before his death, anonymous letters accusing him of financial improprieties, demanding confession of past sins. Poirot examined the fragments she showed him, comparing them with the charred remains from Whitmore's fireplace. His expression grew increasingly grave as the pattern became clear. "The same hand, the same phrases," he observed. "Someone has been orchestrating these deaths for years, using the family's reputation for mysterious endings as camouflage. The revelation cast new light on recent events, but Poirot insisted on gathering additional evidence before drawing conclusions. We descended to the servants' quarters, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, provided crucial testimony about the night of the murder. Mr. Whitmore ordered special brandy to be taken to his study at 10 o'clock, she revealed. He was expecting a very special guest, he said. The young footman, Thomas, delivered the tray and saw him alive and excited about something. Thomas himself confirmed that Helena Ravenswood had been in the corridors around 10:30, visibly distressed and crying. This contradicted her earlier statement about simply retrieving a book, adding another layer of deception to an already complex case. The dinner gong sounded at 7, summoning the household to what felt more like a tribunal than a social gathering. The atmosphere in the dining room was electric with tension, each face bearing the strain of suspicion and fear. Poirot, seated strategically among the suspects, began his psychological examination with characteristic precision. "Madame Helena," he said gently, "the servants have provided testimony that contradicts your earlier statement. You were seen in the corridors at 10:30, clearly distressed. Perhaps you would care to revise your account?" Helena's carefully maintained composure crumbled under the weight of accumulated lies. Through tears, she confessed that Whitmore had summoned her to the study, with promises of financial help for Julian's medical treatments. When she arrived, the door was locked, but she could hear laughter and the sound of glasses clinking within. "I thought he was mocking me," she sobbed, "playing some cruel game with my desperation." The confession had barely registered when Julian Ravenswood burst into the room, his frail form shaking with emotion and exertion. "Stop tormenting my wife," he cried. "If you want a confession, I'll give you one. I killed him. I put the poison in his brandy." The dramatic declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled company, but Poirot remained unmoved. "A gallant lie, my lord, but a lie nonetheless. The poison was not in the decanter, but only in Whitmore's glass, and your timeline contradicts other witness testimony." As the false confession collapsed, a servant entered bearing news that would change everything. A posthumous letter from Whitmore's London solicitors had arrived, containing documents he had sealed with instructions to open only upon his death. Lady Ravenswood's hands trembled as she broke the seal and read the contents. Her face underwent a remarkable transformation, shock giving way to understanding, then to horror, and finally to a kind of resigned despair. "Dear God," she whispered, the papers fluttering from her nerveless fingers. "Charles, what have you done?" The evening's revelations had stripped away layers of deception and false leads, but the truth remained tantalizingly out of reach. Somewhere among the assembled suspects sat a killer whose carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel under Hercule Poirot's relentless investigation. The documents scattered across the polished mahogany table seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the flickering candlelight. Lady Ravenswood's hands trembled as she gathered the papers, her face cycling through expressions of shock, understanding, and finally a kind of terrible resignation. The assembled household watched in frozen silence as she began to read, her voice gaining strength even as the revelations grew more damning. "Charles has written a full confession," she began, her words falling into the oppressive quiet, like stones into still water. "Not merely of his own crimes, but of a partnership that has haunted this family for 20 years. She paused, glancing at Julian with eyes full of maternal anguish. "Your father, my dear son, was not the honourable man we believed him to be." The confession painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached back decades. Edward Ravenswood had provided the English connections and political influence, while Whitmore supplied American capital and ruthless determination. Together they had built an empire on the graves of factory workers, the most tragic being the fire that claimed Sarah Blackwood and 7 other young women. "But there is more," Lady Ravenswood continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charles did not save our estate from ruin. He orchestrated its collapse. He used intermediaries to purchase our debt, manipulated our investments, and systematically drained our resources until marriage to him seemed our only salvation. He created the very crisis he pretended to solve." Julian Ravenswood swayed in his chair, the revelations striking him like physical blows. My father, a murderer, and Charles, our supposed saviour, was our destroyer? Poirot leaned forward, his grey eyes bright with understanding. "Now we begin to see the true motive for murder. Not revenge for past crimes, though that provided convenient misdirection, but the desperate need to prevent exposure of a web of complicity that extended far beyond Mr. Whitmore himself." Dr. Thornfield cleared his throat nervously. "I say, this is all very shocking, but surely we shouldn't speak ill of the dead without proof?" Poirot interrupted gently. "But we have proof, Doctor, not only in these documents, but in the pattern of deaths that have plagued this family. Lord Edward's convenient heart attack when certain irregularities in the estate's finances were discovered. Julian's grandfather's drowning when he began asking uncomfortable questions about missing investments. Each death preserved secrets that would have destroyed reputations and fortunes." Mrs. Pemberton spoke for the first time since the revelations began, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. "You're suggesting that someone has been systematically murdering members of this family to protect these secrets?" "Not members of the family, madame, but those who threaten to expose them. The pattern suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the household, someone present during each crisis, someone whose own position depended upon maintaining the conspiracy of silence." Colonel Ashworth rose abruptly from his chair, his military bearing suddenly rigid with defensive tension. "See here, Poirot, if you're suggesting that I suggest nothing yet, Colonel. I merely observe that you have been present at each of these convenient deaths, that you served as executor of Lord Edward's estate, and that your own military record contains certain irregularities that Mr. Whitmore may have discovered during his systematic collection of compromising information." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Ashworth's face flushed dangerously, but before he could respond, a commotion from the servants' quarters drew our attention. Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, her face pale with alarm. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but there's been an incident. Mrs. Pemberton's tea service was found broken in the conservatory, and there's a strange smell about the pieces, bitter almonds-like." The implication was immediate and terrifying. Someone had attempted to strike again, to silence another potential witness before they could reveal what they knew. Poirot was on his feet instantly, his demeanour transformed from contemplative to commanding. "Inspector Japp, no one must leave this room without supervision. Our killer has revealed their desperation by attempting a second murder, and desperate killers are the most dangerous of all." He turned to face the assembled suspects, his grey eyes hard as steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, the game has entered its final phase. Someone in this room has killed once and attempted to kill again. They will not hesitate to strike a third time if they feel cornered." The revelation of the documents had stripped away the last pretense of civilized behavior. The true motives were now clear, not passion or revenge, but cold calculation and the desperate need to preserve secrets that had already cost too many lives. The killer had revealed themselves through their very desperation to silence potential witnesses. As the household was secured under police supervision, I noticed Poirot examining a small fragment of paper that had been overlooked among the scattered documents, a corner of what appeared to be a telegram bearing only the words, "Tonight or never," in urgent script. "The final piece of the puzzle, Hastings," he murmured, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. "Our killer has been more methodical than we realized, but they have also made the fatal error of believing they could control every variable in their deadly equation. Tomorrow, when minds are clearer and fear has had time to work its way into guilty consciences, we shall gather everyone together for the final revelation. The truth, as always, will prove more shocking than any fiction." The ancient walls of Ravenswood Manor seemed to press closer around us, heavy with the weight of accumulated secrets and the promise of justice finally served. The curse that had haunted the Ravenswood family was about to be revealed as something far more terrifying than supernatural malevolence, the calculated evil of human greed and the lengths to which people will go to protect their carefully constructed lies. The grey November morning brought no respite from the suffocating atmosphere that had settled over Ravenswood Manor like a burial shroud. Thick fog rolled across the estate grounds, wrapping the ancient house in ghostly tendrils that seemed to muffle both sound and hope. The household moved through their morning routines with the mechanical precision of people living under siege, each face bearing the unmistakable marks of sleepless nights and mounting terror. Poirot had spent the hours before dawn in the library, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of our investigation. When I joined him at 7 o'clock, I found him studying a collection of items arranged with mathematical precision across the mahogany desk: the charred letter fragments, the glass stopper from the garden, the telegram remnants, and Whitmore's posthumous confession. His grey eyes held that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelation. "The pattern becomes clear at last, Hastings," he murmured, adjusting the position of the glass stopper with infinite care. "Our killer has been remarkably consistent, a campaign of elimination executed with surgical precision, but in their very consistency they have revealed themselves." Inspector Japp arrived shortly after breakfast, his practical face showing the strain of a case that had grown increasingly complex with each passing hour. He listened with growing frustration as Poirot outlined his developing theory, his notebook filling with details that seemed to contradict the obvious solution. "You're asking me to ignore Blackwood's confession?" Japp demanded. "The man admits to stealing the poison, to standing outside the study window, to 20 years of planning revenge." "Adrian Blackwood is guilty of many things," Poirot replied carefully, "but the actual administration of poison was performed by someone else, someone who used his obvious culpability as the perfect shield. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Pemberton, still shaken from the previous night's attempt on her life, provided the crucial missing piece. Summoned to the library under police escort, she sat rigidly upright, her sharp features pale but determined. "I have remembered something else about that evening," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "When I saw Charles in the hall at 10:30, he wasn't merely agitated. He was carrying a small, leather-bound notebook. He clutched it to his chest as though it contained his very life." Poirot's eyebrows rose with sudden understanding. "A record of his business dealings, perhaps?" "His insurance policy," she replied grimly. "I heard him tell someone on the telephone earlier that day, 'If anything happens to me, the notebook will tell the whole story.'" The search for this missing notebook consumed the next hour. While Japp's men ransacked the obvious hiding places, Poirot returned to the study with that intuitive precision that had solved so many mysteries. Standing where Whitmore had died, he closed his eyes, mentally reconstructing the final moments. He hears the knock. His expected visitor arrives. But first he must hide the evidence, somewhere quick, accessible, yet secure. His gaze swept the book-lined walls before settling on a row of encyclopedias near the desk. One volume sat slightly askew, pushed back in obvious haste. With theatrical flourish, he extracted a small black notebook from behind the displaced volume. Voila! The dead man's final testimony. The notebook's contents were explosive. In Whitmore's precise handwriting were detailed records of 20 years of corruption, bribes paid, deaths covered up, evidence destroyed. But the most damning entries concerned regular payments to a partner identified only as T, substantial sums that had continued right up until the week of his death. Dr. Thornfield, Japp began, but the physician was already shaking his head. I am not T, Thornfield said quietly, his comfortable facade finally cracking. Though I was complicit in their schemes, they had evidence of my involvement in falsifying death certificates, insurance fraud, medical cover-ups. I became their unwilling accomplice to protect my career, my reputation. But you drew the line at murder, Poirot observed. I took the cyanide, yes, intending to use it. But when the moment came, I couldn't. I'm a physician. I've spent my life saving people, not destroying them. I threw the vial away and fled to my room. As Thornfield spoke, I noticed Poirot examining the final entries in the notebook with particular intensity. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read Whitmore's last recorded conversation. T demands complete silence about Chicago. I demand freedom from this partnership. One of us must fall. Inspector, Poirot said suddenly, we must gather everyone in the Great Hall immediately. I have solved the mystery of Charles Whitmore's murder, but the solution is more shocking than any of us imagined. He paused, his grey eyes hard as steel. The killer has been hiding in plain sight, using others as instruments while remaining safely in the shadows. But their greatest deception was not about identity. It was about time itself. The fog outside pressed against the tall windows like grasping fingers as the household assembled for what we all sensed would be the final confrontation. Somewhere among the familiar faces stood a murderer whose patience and cunning had orchestrated deaths across 2 decades. The curse of Ravenswood Manor was about to be revealed as something far more terrifying than supernatural malevolence, the calculated revenge of someone who had waited 20 years for the perfect moment to strike. As thunder rolled across the ancient estate, Hercule Poirot prepared to expose a killer whose true identity would shatter everything we thought we knew about the tragic history of the Ravenswood family. The great hall of Ravenswood Manor had never felt more like a court of judgment than in that grey November afternoon. Thunder rolled across the ancient estate, rattling the tall, mullioned windows, while the fire in the massive stone hearth cast dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with the weight of accumulated secrets. The assembled household sat in a deliberate semicircle before the fireplace, their faces drawn tight with fear and anticipation, each one aware that among them sat a killer whose patience and cunning had orchestrated deaths across 2 decades. Hercule Poirot stood before them with characteristic composure, his small figure somehow dominating the cavernous space. In his hands, he held the black notebook that had been Charles Whitmore's insurance policy and ultimately his death warrant. Inspector Japp positioned himself strategically by the door with 2 constables, ensuring that justice, when finally revealed, could not escape. The methodical elimination. Ladies and gentlemen, Poirot began, his accented voice carrying clearly through the oppressive silence. We have before us a murder that appeared to be the work of Adrian Blackwood, a man with perfect motive, means, and opportunity. Yet from the beginning, something troubled my little grey cells about this convenient solution. The pieces fit too perfectly, like a puzzle assembled by someone who wished us to see only what they intended. He moved with measured steps, his grey eyes cataloguing every reaction. Let us examine our suspects systematically. Monsieur Blackwood, you stole cyanide, you watched from the garden, you had 20 years of hatred burning in your heart. Yet when the moment came, you threw away the poison and fled. Why? Because through that window you saw Charles Whitmore smile, the smile of a man who believed he had just secured a great victory. Blackwood nodded miserably. He raised his glass as though toasting someone. He looked triumphant, not afraid. Precisely. Our victim expected his visitor, welcomed them, believed he was negotiating from a position of strength. Poirot turned to Dr. Thornfield. You, Doctor, provided unwitting access to the poison through your medical bag. Your conscience troubled you enough to confess your complicity in past cover-ups. But a man who has dedicated his life to healing does not easily turn to cold-blooded murder, especially when that conscience finally drove him to seek redemption. The key revelation about tea. Poirot held up the notebook, its pages catching the firelight. This little book holds the key to everything. For 20 years, Charles Whitmore made regular payments to someone identified only as T, substantial sums that coincided not with medical treatments or legal fees, but with crucial decisions about the estate. Each payment followed a convenient death, a silenced inquiry, a buried scandal. He paused, letting the implication settle over the room like a shroud. We assumed T stood for Thornfield, but the amounts were far too large for medical silence. No, these payments were made to someone with far greater power, someone who could orchestrate the systematic destruction of threats to their carefully constructed world. Mrs. Pemberton sat rigidly upright in her chair, her sharp features betraying nothing, but I noticed how her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her walking stick. The physical evidence analysis. The brilliance of this crime lay not in its execution, but in its preparation, Poirot continued. 2 vials of cyanide were taken from Dr. Thornfield's bag, not one. The first was allowed to be discovered missing, creating the perfect suspect in Mr. Blackwood. The second was used for the actual murder, then disposed of so thoroughly that we found only fragments. He produced the glass stopper from his pocket. This was thrown into the garden in a moment of panic, but our killer realized their mistake. Later that night, they crept out to retrieve it, leaving traces of mud on evening clothes, disturbing the earth that had been compressed by Mr. Blackwood's long vigil. The psychological profile. We must ask ourselves, who possessed the patience for such an elaborate deception? Who had intimate knowledge of every family secret, every weakness, every hidden shame? Who could move through this house invisible and unremarked, present at every crisis, yet never suspected? His gaze swept the assembled faces with surgical precision. The answer lies not in passion or greed, but in something far more dangerous, the cold calculation of someone who has nursed grievances for decades, who has turned their very position of trust into a weapon of destruction. The final accusation. Poirot stopped directly before Mrs. Pemberton, his grey eyes boring into hers with relentless intensity. Madame Pemberton, or should I say Miss Lydia Thornton? Sister to the factory manager who died in shame after the Chicago fire, blamed for deaths that were caused by the greed of Edward Ravenswood and Charles Whitmore? A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Pemberton remained frozen, but something flickered in her eyes, not fear, but perhaps relief that the long deception was finally ending. You changed your name, invented a family connection, and inserted yourself into this household 20 years ago. You were patient, extraordinarily patient. You studied them, learned their weaknesses, collected their secrets. When Lord Edward began to suspect your true purpose, you arranged his convenient heart attack. When his father grew curious about missing investments, you orchestrated his drowning, each death carefully staged, each one removing a threat to your ultimate goal. The silence was deathly, broken only by the crackling fire and the drumming of rain against the windows. Mrs. Pemberton's composure began to crack, years of carefully maintained facades crumbling under the weight of exposure. But Charles Whitmore was different, Poirot continued relentlessly. He was your partner in this dance of death, your unwitting accomplice. The payments in his notebook were not blackmail, they were partnership fees. You fed him information about the family's vulnerabilities, helped him orchestrate their financial ruin, guided him toward marriage with Lady Ravenswood. Together, you destroyed the Ravenswoods from within. The breaking point. Yet partnerships built on murder are inherently unstable. When Whitmore received that threatening letter, which you yourself wrote, he realized someone knew about Chicago. He began compiling evidence as protection, not knowing his greatest threat sat at his own dinner table, night after night, year after year. Mrs. Pemberton rose slowly from her chair, her walking stick trembling in her grip. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but filled with decades of suppressed rage. "They burned my brother alive," she whispered, her words carrying clearly through the hall. 8 people died because Edward Ravenswood and Charles Whitmore ordered those factory doors locked to prevent a strike. My brother was blamed, driven to suicide by their lies. They built their fortunes on graves and never showed a moment's remorse. The confession hung in the air, stark and terrible. Lady Ravenswood pressed a handkerchief to her lips, while Julian gripped his chair with white-knuckled intensity. The curse of Ravenswood Manor was finally revealed, not supernatural malevolence, but the methodical revenge of a woman who had spent 20 years orchestrating the destruction of those who had destroyed her family. Yet even as the truth emerged, I sensed that Hercule Poirot had not finished his revelation. The final pieces of this elaborate puzzle, the exact method, the complete timeline, the full extent of the conspiracy, awaited the ultimate confrontation that would bring justice to Ravenswood Manor at last. Mrs. Pemberton stood frozen before the assembled household, her confession hanging in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Yet Hercule Poirot remained motionless, his grey eyes studying her with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to a final, devastating revelation. "You have told us why, madame," he said quietly, "but you have not told us how. The method troubles my little grey cells considerably." Inspector Japp stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming in the firelight. "She's confessed, Poirot. Surely that's enough." "Non, Inspector. A confession without truth is merely noise." Poirot moved closer to Mrs. Pemberton, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You see, madame, there is a fundamental flaw in your account. You claim to have poisoned Mr. Whitmore's brandy glass, yet the servant's testimony tells us the tray was prepared and delivered at 10 o'clock. How could you ensure he would drink from the poisoned glass rather than pouring fresh brandy from the decanter?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her composed features. I waited until he poured, then switched the glasses when his attention was elsewhere." "Impossible. Mr. Blackwood saw him raise his glass in triumph just before 11:15. He was alone then, already drinking." "No, madame, your method is flawed." Poirot turned to address the room. The true killer understood something fundamental about their victim, his habits, his weaknesses, his absolute predictability. He moved to the mantelpiece, his fingers tracing the carved stone. Charles Whitmore was a man of rigid routine. Every evening at precisely 10:30, he took his medication for a chronic stomach condition, a powder. Dissolved in brandy. Dr. Thornfield prescribed it, did you not, doctor? Thornfield nodded miserably. Bismuth and charcoal compound. He insisted on taking it with brandy, said it masked the bitter taste. Precisement. And who in this household would know of this medical routine? Who would have access to his private medication? Who could substitute cyanide for bismuth without detection? Poirot's gaze swept the room before settling on a figure who had remained silent throughout the evening's revelations. Mrs. Reynolds, he said softly. The housekeeper stepped forward from the shadows near the door, her weathered face calm with resignation. I wondered when you would notice me, Mr. Poirot. Servants are invisible to most people, aren't they? We move through their lives like ghosts, seeing everything, knowing everything, yet never truly seen. Lady Ravenswood gasped. Mrs. Reynolds? But you've been with us for 15 years. 16 years, my lady, since shortly after my son Thomas died in that factory fire in Chicago, the fire your first husband and Charles Whitmore caused with their greed. Her voice remained steady, matter-of-fact, as though discussing the evening's menu. I took this position to watch them, to learn their habits, to wait for the perfect moment. And Mrs. Pemberton? Japp demanded. Is my daughter Lydia Thornton? She came later, playing the role of distant cousin to gather information I couldn't access. But the killing, that was my work alone. Poirot nodded slowly. You substituted cyanide for his stomach powder that evening. When he felt the familiar discomfort after dinner, he went to his study and took his usual dose, dissolved in brandy. Death would have been swift, perhaps 30 seconds of realization before the end. He knew, Mrs. Reynolds said with grim satisfaction. In those final moments, he looked at the empty medicine packet and understood. 20 years too late, but he understood. The glass stopper found in the garden? I threw it from the kitchen window after breaking the vial. I thought it had shattered completely, but one piece survived. She looked at her daughter with infinite sadness. Lydia confessed to protect me. She thought an old woman's life was worth less than a young woman's future. Mrs. Pemberton, Lydia Thornton, broke her silence at last. She's suffered enough. She lost her son, her husband, everything. Let me take the blame. Non, Poirot said firmly. Justice demands truth, not noble sacrifice. Mrs. Reynolds, you are under arrest for the murder of Charles Whitmore. As Japp moved forward with the handcuffs, the elderly housekeeper drew herself up with dignity. I regret nothing, Mr. Poirot. They destroyed my family and built their fortune on graves. I simply ensured that justice, however delayed, was finally served. The ancient walls of Ravenswood Manor seemed to exhale as the truth finally emerged from decades of shadow and deception. The curse that had haunted the family was revealed as something far more terrifying than supernatural malevolence. The patient, methodical vengeance of a mother's love twisted into an instrument of destruction. As the police led both women away, Poirot stood before the dying fire, his grey eyes reflecting the flames. The tragedy of this case, mes amis, is not merely that murder was committed, but that the seeds were planted in a moment of callous greed 20 years ago. Charles Whitmore and Edward Ravenswood chose profit over human life, and that choice set in motion events that would eventually consume them all. He adjusted his tie with characteristic precision. Come, Hastings, our work here is finished. The curse of Ravenswood Manor is broken, not by supernatural intervention, but by the relentless pursuit of truth. It is always the same story, only the costumes change. The grey November dawn found Ravenswood Manor transformed, as though the exposure of truth had lifted a weight that had pressed down upon its ancient stones for decades. The police vehicles had departed in the early hours, taking with them the architects of 20 years of methodical revenge, leaving behind a household that could finally breathe freely after suffocating under the burden of accumulated secrets. Poirot stood in the great hall, his grey eyes surveying the assembled family with characteristic precision. Lady Ravenswood sat by the dying fire, her face bearing the marks of sleepless grief, but also a kind of terrible relief. Julian and Helena remained close together, the barriers of secrecy that had separated them finally demolished by the night's revelations. "You require a complete accounting," Poirot said quietly, arranging several documents on the mahogany table with methodical care. The conspiracy began 20 years ago when Sarah Reynolds lost her son Thomas in the Chicago factory fire. Unlike others who might have collapsed into despair, she transformed her grief into something far more dangerous, a systematic campaign of destruction. He traced a timeline across the papers. Within months, she had secured employment in Charles Whitmore's household, studying his habits, his weaknesses, his connections. When she discovered his partnership with Lord Edward Ravenswood, she realized the scope of the conspiracy that had killed her son. Her daughter Lydia Thornton was recruited years later to move in society as Mrs. Pemberton, gathering intelligence that a servant could never access. Julian's voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "My father's death, was that part of their plan?" "Your father discovered irregularities in the estate's finances and began investigating. Mrs. Reynolds administered digitalis over several weeks, disguised in his evening whiskey. The symptoms mimicked natural heart failure perfectly, and Dr. Thornfield, already compromised by his own complicity, accepted the diagnosis without question." Dr. Thornfield, who had arrived to attend to Julian, bore himself like a man reprieved from the gallows. "I should have seen the pattern," he said heavily. "But I was terrified of exposure, and I convinced myself each death was natural." "You were not alone in your blindness, Doctor," Poirot replied with compassion. "They understood human nature perfectly, that servants are invisible, that people see what they expect to see, that family secrets create their own fog of confusion." Helena stepped forward, her green eyes clear for the first time since our arrival. "And Charles's pursuit of me? That was Whitmore's own depravity, though Mrs. Reynolds encouraged it, knowing it would create additional tensions and provide alternative suspects. The brilliance of their scheme lay in its patience. They waited, watched, and positioned themselves perfectly before striking." Lady Ravenswood looked up from her contemplation of the fire. "The letter that frightened Charles. Written by her daughter to set events in motion. When Charles went to his study that final night, he believed he was preparing to negotiate. He took his medication as usual, never suspecting that death had been substituted for medicine. The irony is that he died believing he was in control." As the morning wore on, Poirot methodically answered every question, demonstrating how maternal love, twisted by grief, had driven someone toward 20 years of patient destruction. The curse of Ravenswood Manor was finally revealed not as supernatural malevolence, but as the terrible consequences of human choices. When we prepared to depart that afternoon, the ancient house seemed lighter somehow, as though truth had exorcised the ghosts that had haunted its corridors. Lady Ravenswood walked with us to the entrance hall, her step firmer than it had been in years. "What becomes of us now?" she asked quietly. Poirot studied her with gentle authority. "You survive, madame. You acknowledge the sins of the past, make what restitution is possible, and build something better from the ruins." That is all any of us can do when confronted with the consequences of our choices. As our car wound down the long driveway, I turned to Poirot, who was meticulously adjusting his tie. "How did you know for certain it was Mrs. Reynolds rather than Mrs. Pemberton?" "The stomach powder, Hastings. Only a servant or a wife knows the intimate routines of a man's digestion. Mrs. Pemberton was a guest. She would not know the precise moment he took his medicine. But Mrs. Reynolds controlled the domestic rhythm of the house." He paused, watching the hedgerows pass. "Furthermore, there was the psychology of the invisible woman. She stood in that room while we discussed suspects and motives, refilling our glasses as if she were furniture. It is dangerous arrogance to assume that those who serve us do not also judge us." The train station appeared ahead, and as we settled into our carriage, Poirot leaned back with satisfaction. 4 lives wasted, Whitmore and Edward Ravenswood on greed, Mrs. Reynolds and her daughter on revenge. It is a balanced equation, though tragic. But the balance is restored, and justice, sharp as a scalpel, has been served. As the train carried us back to London, leaving the mysteries of Ravenswood Manor behind, I reflected that the greatest curse of all had been the illusion that the past could be buried without consequence. Truth, as always, had proved more persistent than any ghost. The familiar comfort of our London flat welcomed us as evening shadows lengthened across the city streets. Poirot moved immediately to his desk, arranging the case notes with that meticulous precision that had become second nature over decades of detective work. The fire crackled in the grate, and for the first time in days, the oppressive weight of Ravenswood Manor's accumulated secret seemed to lift from our shoulders. I settled into my customary chair with a whisky, watching as my friend completed his ritual organization of evidence. Only when every document was perfectly aligned did he finally permit himself to relax with a satisfied sigh. "You are troubled, Hastings," he observed, his grey eyes studying me with characteristic perception. "The solution does not satisfy your sense of justice, perhaps?" I swirled the amber liquid thoughtfully. "I suppose I expected something more dramatic. That a housekeeper orchestrated everything seems almost anticlimactic after all the complexities we uncovered." "Ah, but that is precisely the point, mon ami. We expect our villains to be extraordinary, yet the most dangerous criminals are often those who hide in plain sight. Mrs. Reynolds lived every day in the house of her enemies, serving their meals while her son's grave lay unmarked and forgotten. That kind of proximity to injustice can poison the soul more thoroughly than any chemical compound." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the London evening. The tragedy of Ravenswood Manor was not merely that murder was committed, but that the original crime was never properly addressed. Had Edward Ravenswood and Charles Whitmore faced justice 20 years ago, 8 families would have received compensation, and Mrs. Reynolds might have found healing rather than hatred. "Justice delayed became injustice multiplied," I murmured. "Précisément. Each person who remained silent became an accomplice to the conspiracy. Dr. Thornfield suspected but chose career over conscience. Colonel Ashworth witnessed irregularities but preferred loyalty to truth. They created the environment in which Mrs. Reynolds could operate undetected because they had already established that appearances mattered more than justice. A comfortable silence settled between us. After a time, Poirot returned to his chair, extracting a telegram from his waistcoat. "Inspector Japp telephoned earlier," he said, scanning the message. "Mrs. Reynolds has made a full confession, sparing her daughter from prosecution. She will face trial for murder, though given her age and circumstances, the sentence may be lenient. Mrs. Pemberton has been released with a warning, conspiracy to deceive, but no actual crime." "And the Ravenswoods?" They will survive. The poison has been drained from that house. Julian and Helena have each other, and money that can now be used to heal rather than control. I observed them as we departed, holding hands not with desperation, but with the quiet assurance of survivors reaching shore. He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "But tell me, Hastings, do you believe Mrs. Reynolds was justified?" I considered carefully. She lost everything to their greed. Surely that counts for something. Understandable? Perhaps. Justified? None. His voice carried unusual severity. The moment we begin to justify murder, however sympathetic the motive, we abandon the principles that separate civilization from chaos. Mrs. Reynolds had every right to her grief, to her anger, even to her desire for justice, but she had no right to become judge, jury, and executioner. He moved to the fireplace, warming his hands against the flames. Her revenge solved nothing. Her son remains dead. Her own life is forfeit. True justice would have been prosecution 20 years ago, reforms to prevent future tragedies. Instead, we have only more graves and more grief. The clock chimed 9, its measured tones marking time's steady passage. Poirot straightened his tie with characteristic precision. "This is why I pursue justice with such determination, mon ami. Not merely to punish the guilty, but to demonstrate that truth matters, that no crime, however carefully planned, however long delayed, can ultimately escape exposure." As he closed the Ravenswood file and placed it carefully in the cabinet where so many other cases resided, I reflected on the lessons learned. The curse of Ravenswood Manor was broken, its secrets exposed, its guilty parties identified. Yet the underlying conditions that produce such tragedies, greed, pride, the casual cruelty of the powerful, those required solutions beyond even the most brilliant detective's capabilities. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said with sudden brightness. "The case is concluded, but the stomach begins to complain. I know of a small Belgian restaurant where the carbonade is acceptable, provided one instructs the chef precisely. Let us celebrate the triumph of order over chaos." We stepped into the London night, leaving the darkness behind us, ready for whatever new puzzle tomorrow might bring to my friend's door. Such, as Poirot would say, is the eternal nature of human existence. We solve individual crimes and expose particular deceptions, but the war against injustice continues always. The fire burned low in the grate, the clock ticked steadily onward, and another chapter in Hercule Poirot's chronicle was complete.